Now, the 1,000 years may be understood in two ways, so far as it occurs to me, either because these things happen in the 6,000 of years or sixth millennium, the latter part of which is now passing, as if during the sixth day, which is to be followed by a Sabbath, which has no evening, the endless rest of the saints. So that speaking of a part under the name of the whole, he calls the last part of the millennium, the part that is which had yet to expire before the end of the world, 1,000 years. Or he used the 1,000 years as an equivalent for the whole duration of this world, employing the number of perfection to mark the fullness of time. For 1,000 is the cube of 10. St. Augustine, City of God.
You're listening to A Word Fitly Spoken. I'm Zelwyn Heide, here today with David Appold to continue our discussion of the book of Revelation. David, how are you doing?
Doing great, Zelwyn. It's good to be with you in the new year, 2023. Looking forward to it.
The year of our Lord.
Yes.
So how was your Christmas break? How did that all go for you?
Oh, it went well. We had a little bit of snow here. Well, quite a bit of snow, actually. Some really cold weather, a little bit of ice right before Christmas. So that made the parking lot on Christmas Eve and Christmas Day kind of a mess. We don't have, it's not typical to get a lot of snow. So we don't have like a plowing contract. And most people down here, I don't know who plows your church parking lot, Zelwyn. Do you have members or do you have a service that does it?
There's members that come by and do it.
So a lot of your folks probably have the the plow on the front of the truck. We don't have too many like that down here. So it was kind of just ice rink and skate your way into church. But even that being the case, by the time it was Christmas Eve and Christmas Day, people were ready to get out, and we had a good Christmas.
Good. Glad to hear it. I know that on Christmas Day for us in particular, the weather was, for the lack of a better way of putting it, windy. And it caused something of you could call it a blizzard, but it was mostly in the afternoon. We were still able to have a Christmas morning service and get that all through. But then again, it was kind of slipping and sliding too. But once the afternoon hit, it was, there was no visibility left. The snow was blowing everywhere. So it was an interesting Christmas weekend, but things have cleared up now, and it's a nice crisp day this morning when we're recording this, and it's just, I think it's shaping up to be a lovely day.
Remind me again, are you typically a one Sunday service church congregation?
Well, I have two churches, but one at each. Yeah.
Yeah. So did you do one at each?
Yep. The Christmas morning it was clear enough. I was able to get out and be able to do the services. So
we typically have two, I have an 8:00 and a 10:45, but we just did one service on Christmas Day. And it makes me wish that we had a bigger sanctuary. The reason we have two is because we can't all fit into one. But when you can pack everybody into one service and you get people who don't typically worship together, singing together, it was quite powerful, especially, the great hymns that everybody wants to belt out. "O come, all ye faithful, now sing we, now rejoice." Good stuff.
That's great. We sometimes will get that with our special services, like on Good Friday, for example.
You do them together
when we do them together. But it is what it is. No, it is. It's nice when the whole church can gather together. Certainly. Speaking of the whole church gathering, though, let's dip into Revelation, shall we?
Sure. Yeah, we'll get right into it here.
So we're continuing our discussion, and we're moving into chapter 20, which of course is
very obscure.
The chapter that everybody wants to talk about and to know what it means. And we'll have to probably spend a lot of time, talking about all the little details. But can you lead us into the chapter? Where have we come from? Where are we going? That sort of thing. How does chapter 20 relate to the rest of Revelation?
Yeah, I think it's good to notice structural markers in the book of Revelation, because one of the things that we've been that I think we've consistently said, there's a lot of things, if we've been doing this series, over 2 years now. So we've probably, in some places, changed our opinions on things as we've gone along. But
Right.
one of the things I think that we've consistently tried to say, Zelwyn, is that the book of Revelation is, one big vision, one revelation, and that, I'm familiar with the idea that it's cyclical, almost like John is seeing the whole history of, the time from Christ to Judgment Day over and over again.
Hmm.
But I don't think that actually does justice to the book. I think a better way to view it is that everything that's happened up till now in the book of Revelation has been first century kind of stuff. And I know that there are places where it sounds like he's describing the end of the world. He's describing, this huge judgment and these huge plagues that are happening and hailstorms and all that stuff. But one of the things that I've tried to do as we've gone along here is at least give you a way to understand that in light of the first century, because I want to take seriously what he says what Jesus says, I will show you things that are about to happen. And so in the book of Revelation, if we read it as things that were within the life of the apostle, within the time of John's writing, what we have up till chapter 20 is kind of the things that have happened right around the year 70 AD. And so now in chapter 20, it's going to open up to, okay, what comes next? And so this really is where in my understanding of the book of Revelation, the book opens up beyond just that first century and is now going to look ahead. There's a revelation of what is to come. And it's very brief, really, to be honest with you. It's certainly a chapter that intrigues people because it talks about the millennium, and there's so much hangs on what you say about the millennium in, eschatological debates these days. But what I would say is this part of the book, chapter 20, comes at the culmination of, the destruction of the whore of Babylon, the battle between the beast and Christ riding out on his horse. So we've seen the whore of Babylon fall, we've seen the beast be destroyed, and now the devil himself. So those three enemies that came up back in chapter 12, the dragon, his beasts, those things are now being conquered in reverse order. So the first one to fall is the whore of Babylon, and I would equate that with the land beast, so to speak. Then the sea beast, Rome, and then now, okay, what do we do about Satan himself, and how does this open up then into the mission of the church?
Sure. And I mean, even if you tend to see the book of Revelation more in terms of something that is happening not just in the first century, like I tend to do. I mean, I certainly appreciate, everything that 70 AD brings into the discussion, and I think that's worth considering. But even if you do see it as something that continues and like even repeats itself throughout history, there is something about chapter 20 that, I mean, it's like it's looking forward, right? It's looking
Yeah.
to what is yet to come. I mean, in that sense, there really is a still kind of a not yetness to this, especially because when we get into the final defeat of Satan and the judgment on, before the white throne and all of that, these are things that are obviously a once for all kind of thing,
Yeah, and
right?
you can. Yeah, I mean, even in the when you look at the numbers that we've seen in the book of Revelation so far, especially the time notices, I think the first one came up in one of the letters to one of the churches. You're going to face persecution for 10 days, okay, a short
Hmm.
time. And then you have references to things like 42 months, okay, so that's
Hmm.
3.5 years. 1,260 days, again, 3.5 years. Time times and half a time. Again, that's meant to symbolize or signify a short time, 3.5. It's like a half of a seven, right? So it's an incomplete. But now John's going to use the number millennium, 1,000 years. And so we're talking about, okay, we'll get into the question of literal versus figurative in a minute here, but we're talking about something that is obviously a long time. Even if
Right.
it's a literal 1,000 years, well, that's a lot longer than any of the other time references John has mentioned so far. So certainly this chapter opens up beyond just things that are about to happen to open the horizons on things that are going to continue to happen.
Right. Although it is worth pointing out, since we're kind of starting the discussion already, the fact that the 1,000 years is a defined period is something that we cannot ignore either, right? There's a beginning to it. We'll
Yeah.
discuss when we might think that beginning is, but there's also a clear end.
Yeah.
So whatever the 1,000 years is, it cannot be, the world without end, the kingdom to come kind of a
Yeah,
thing.
that's a good point. That's a good point to make. It has a beginning and a termination. It's not
Hmm.
the eternal state. The eternal
Right.
state is beyond the millennium. And I would just mention here too, if you're looking for kind of structural markers in the book of the Revelation, there's these four times where John is told, "I will show you, I will show you, I will show you," so chapter 20 comes at the end of the third "I will show you." And that began back in chapter 17. So I will show you the whore of Babylon. And that's chapter 17. Then the whore's fall is chapter 18. Then the battle with the beast is chapter 19. And now, once those things have been conquered, now there's time for the millennium to begin. And everything that is encompassed in the millennium doesn't begin until those other things fall. So again, I don't see this as John, kind of starting over again and saying,
Hmm.
okay, now let's go back to the very beginning. I think there is a progression through the book of a continued story, a continued revelation, and this comes at the end of the fight with the whore and with the beast. Now comes the millennium.
Sure. Sure. Well, we should probably talk about the basic structure of the chapter so that we can really get into a discussion of what it says, to really
Yeah.
get into to delve into what everybody wants to talk about here. So, how would you divide chapter 20 and why is that significant?
Yeah, I would say there's three visions in chapter 20. So in the whole book of Revelation, there's, if you have the big picture, there's these four things that John is shown. Chapter 20 comes at the end of the third of those showings. I will show you the whore of Babylon. But now in chapter 20, if you just look for "then I saw," that's kind of the marker. Then I saw in verse 1, then I saw in verse 4, and then in verse 11 you get that again, "then I saw." So I would take this as three visions, and then between verses 11 and 15 there's a couple more uses of that, "then I saw, then I saw." But the context seems to me clear that that's all part of the same, that's contained in the one vision. Okay, so the first vision is verses 1 through 3, and that's the vision of an angel coming down and binding Satan. Okay. Then verses 4 through 10 describes the reign of the martyrs and the loosing out of Satan and his final defeat. And then verses 11 through 15, I'm gonna call that the final. That's the final judgment. That's Judgment Day. Some people would, I think, if you've ever talked with a dispensationalist, they'll use the term the Great White Throne Judgment. That comes as the third of these visions in chapter 20.
Why are you talking to dispensationalists, though, David?
Well, I live in Kentucky, so they're kind
Oh,
of hard to
fair.
avoid.
Fair. I'll give you
And
that.
besides, they're interesting.
You never know what
The,
they're going to say.
yeah, the amillennialists are kind of boring. The pre-mill
Uh,
guys, they're exciting.
well, very good. Okay, so with that division in mind, then, we want to turn our attention in the last part of this first segment to that first segment, right? To verses 1 through 3 in chapter 20. And in this segment, we have, a couple of very clear things happening, which, of course, is the binding of Satan and also the beginning of the 1,000-year period.
Hmm.
Actually, basically the whole of the 1,000-year period. And honestly, this is a lot of where the debate centers, right? Is in these three verses. What does this mean or whatever? But let's start with Satan himself. Okay, we have the angel coming down, having the key to the bottomless pit, the pit being where the demons come from. The kind of their abode, if you will,
Yeah.
and a great chain with which to bind Satan. So, what exactly is happening here? What is the angel doing? Or maybe the better question to start with is, who is this angel? Because that's also a point of debate, right?
Yeah, I mean, throughout the book, there's always, there's these various angels. Sometimes the referent is to the pastors of churches, right?
Hmm.
Think back to the letters that John is told to transcribe. They're sent to the angels of the churches, and we take that as the pastors. In other cases, the angels are, just like it says, they're legitimate angels. There are some people who take some of the angels as, like, one of the angels, I believe, as Christ himself. I've read commentators or commenters here who would take this angel as the angel of Jesus, as a reference to the Holy Spirit. So there is lots of debate about who exactly the angel is. Certainly, because he comes down and has this authority over Satan, I think we would take this as more than just a pastor of a local congregation. And so seeing this angel as someone who comes with the authority of Christ, whether it's Christ himself or a broader use of that term angel to maybe encompass the activity of the Holy Spirit, I think it's plausible to take it that way. Or something like we saw back in chapter 12 with Michael, an archangel of some sort. But something more than a human figure, I think, is implied here.
You don't have the keys over Satan? Is that what you're saying?
Well, we'll get into how we use the key, how the keys continue to be used, but at least the description here of an angel coming down from heaven, holding in his hand the key to the bottomless pit and a great chain, seizing the dragon, the ancient serpent. I think that calls for more than the local pastor binding and loosing sins in heaven.
Well, maybe in Kentucky, but up here in North Dakota, we are doing great things in the spirit. No,
Well,
I'm
okay. So
joking,
if you want to go that way, Zelwyn, then I think, okay, take the key. Well, let's not get into that just yet, because we'll talk about church discipline and what that has to do with the millennium in a minute, right?
sure, sure. Well, but on a more serious note here, I mean, we do have this angel, and I'm willing to say that he's just an angel, someone designated by God. You could even say an archangel. It's just for the sake of argument, let's call him an archangel. But he's been given this key to the bottomless pit, showing at least that God has the authority over the pit. The pit is not kind of in hostility to God, and there's nothing he can do about it. God is the one still dictating the flow of
Mhm.
events here. And with this key and with this great chain, the devil himself is bound so that he's not able to do what he had been doing before, especially when we have the deceiving of the nations until the 1,000 years are ended. So, I mean, the fact that Satan is being bound here is significant, if only because, there's something about what he was doing before that he's not able to do now. And I think
Right.
that is a great indicator. I mean, we should really keep that in mind when we're talking about the 1,000 years, right?
Yeah, the before this, there had been a reference to the abyss, but the abyss was open. So I think it was back in, oh gosh, I can't remember the chapter number now, but remember before there were things coming up out of the abyss. There were the locust scorpions came up out of the abyss. Now, so that there was like a highway open between the abyss and earth, and things were coming out of the abyss onto the earth. Now, with everything that's transpired in the book, again, this is why I don't see it as just purely a cyclical thing. Everything that has happened has led to this progress where now the abyss is closed, it's sealed over, Satan is suppressed there, he's not completely inactive, and we'll talk about that maybe after the break would be good, but he is put down into the pit is sealed up. in a lot of ways, this is reminiscent of what happens to Jesus, right? Jesus is seized, he's taken to the cross, he's thrown into the grave, it's sealed over, he breaks out. But the devil is, he's a bad imitator. And so what happens to him is that he actually is sealed up and he can't get out until he's released, But again, that doesn't happen of his own accord. He's released in order to be finally destroyed.
And we'll talk about that more when we get back after the break, right after this. Welcome back to A Word Fitly Spoken. I'm Zelwyn Heide here with David Appold, continuing our discussion of the book of Revelation. So in the previous section, David, we're starting to talk about the binding of Satan in the first section of chapter 20. But now we need to actually talk about, what exactly that means. What does it mean for Satan to be bound? What is he being prevented from doing? And I know this is all contingent on how you view the 1,000 years. But let's just start the discussion. What does the actual binding mean?
Yeah, I mean, I think so maybe if we have two possibilities in our minds that can help us clarify, either he is completely inactive. That would be one possibility here, right? So the angel comes down, throws him in the pit. He's chained up. It's all sealed over. He has no activity. He has no force on earth at all. Or you could take this as he is still active in some way, but he is restrained from doing what he previously had done. And the text itself makes reference to the specific activity of the devil that is bound up here when it says, so that he might not deceive the nations any longer. So it's especially this activity of Satan as the deceiver of the whole world, who's held the world in lies, who's held the world in, under that kind of darkness. That's the way that I take it. It doesn't mean that there is no satanic activity during the millennium, but that he is suppressed, and what he had been able to do before, he's no longer able to do, which is to deceive the whole world. Whole nations are no longer under his deceit. Does that make sense?
It does. And I'm thinking also about what we've said before, like in the episode on territorial spirits, and that idea of what is the spirit ruling over the nation or whatever. Would you say then that the binding of Satan here is that he can no longer hold out against the coming of God? I mean, that sort of thing. Like, holding a nation in deception is one thing, but like holding them in the way that he did in antiquity, for example, would be another, right?
Right. And I think, think of some of the things that Jesus himself said. Now is the ruler of this world cast out, right before he goes to the cross. So that didn't mean that, the devil is completely non-existent after the death and resurrection of our Lord. But it did mean that there was a transition. There was a big change that happened after that point, right? And I take this similarly. Now the strong man has been bound by the stronger one, and the stronger man, Christ, is beginning to plunder the goods of the strong man, the devil. But he's not it doesn't mean that the church will not face some kind of satanic attack. It doesn't mean that there's, in the millennium, it is just all peace all the time. It just means that what previously had been the MO of the devil, to deceive whole nations, no longer is going to be the case. That the word of Christ, the word of truth, the light of the gospel is going to, at least here, begin to go out into the whole world, and the devil will not be able to stand against it.
Okay, but just so that we are clear in what we're saying here, at least in our thinking, we also said in the previous segment that the angel who binds him is an angel, right? But if you're referring back to what Jesus says, the stronger man binding the strong man, Christ himself doing that, is there a conflict between those two statements?
I don't think so, because of things. What term should we use here? Well, put it this way: who's at work in the life of the church? Is it Jesus or is it the Holy Spirit?
Both.
Right, it's both, right? And so the word and the spirit are at work in the world. Jesus binding the strong man doesn't rule out the fact that he authorizes his apostles to go out and to evangelize the whole world. He works through them, right? And so I think in a similar way, you can see here the angel coming down from heaven is not coming on his own authority. He doesn't come with his own power and might, but he's authorized by Jesus, similar to maybe the way that we talk about Michael casting the devil out of heaven. How does he conquer the devil? Well, it's through the blood of the Lamb, the testimony that he conquers. So it's not because of something apart from Christ, but Christ's victory on the cross and in the resurrection, now sending the Spirit, now authorizing the apostles, now at work in the church. These things are not opposed to each other, but they're all, what's the right term here to use, Zelwyn? They're concurrent. They're working together.
Right, right. Well, I mean, we do this too. If we send someone to do something on our behalf, we can honestly say that we've done it, right?
Right.
Even if we weren't the ones who actually physically, like in that moment, did it, we still authorized it to happen, and that's why it happened, kind of a thing.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, we do this too in our language. I'm just trying to make sure that we understand this clearly.
Yeah, no, it's very helpful because, think back to other keys, right? This binding certainly brings to mind the use of a key. And so at the very beginning of Revelation, it was Jesus who said, I hold in my hand the key to death and hell, death and Hades. And so now that, to bind up the abyss, to seal it over, well, you would presumably have to have the key to be able to do that. Well, who had the key? It was Jesus in the beginning, but now it's an angel. So did the angel take the key? Did he steal the keys from Jesus? In the first segment, you kind of jokingly put it this way, but you're right that the ministers of the church, the angels of the congregations, we do use the keys that Christ has entrusted to us. And by doing so, what this angel does in John's Revelation continues to happen in the life of the church. The devil is bound up in the abyss. He's held down.
Sure. Well, then I guess that leads to the next question. I mean, if we're going to identify the binding of Satan with his inability to deceive in the way that he has before, does that mean then that the binding is in progress? Like, are we living in the time when Satan is bound, or is the binding of Satan something still yet to come, so that the binding will signal the beginning of something new?
Mm-hmm.
When exactly is Satan bound so that he's no longer able to deceive?
Yeah. Are you asking when does the millennium begin?
Well, it's
Because
kind of the
that's,
same question, yeah.
yeah, that's what's right. So it says that this happens at the beginning of the millennium, at the
Right.
beginning of 1,000 years. The devil will be bound for 1,000 years. And if your question is when does that start?
Mm-hmm.
All these questions kind of swirl together. When does the 1,000 years begin? Is it a literal 1,000 years, or is it a figurative 1,000 years? The way that I take it here, we read from St. Augustine at the beginning of the episode, and I think most of our listeners are probably Lutheran pastors or Lutheran laymen, And so they're going to guess where we're going to go with this, which is to take the 1,000 years as the time of the church, right? So the devil is bound during the time in which the gospel is proclaimed through the whole world, the activity of the church, and he won't be unbound until the end. Okay. Now again, this is why we say it doesn't mean the binding of the devil doesn't mean he is completely inactive, because obviously, right, since the beginning of the church, there has been continued satanic activity in the world, but his power is limited. The deceit that he was able to have before Christ and before the coming of the Holy Spirit at Pentecost is no longer the case.
Okay. How then do we connect up the idea that chapter 20 is something that is still, how do you want to say? If
Ongoing?
well, I mean, not so much ongoing. How do we connect that with what we said before, where we said that there's a progression in the book of Revelation? Because if we want to say, strictly speaking, the binding of Satan is the time of the church, that sounds an awful lot like recapitulation, like we're just going over the same period again. How do we make it clear that there is still a progression from what has happened before?
Yeah, and that's where seeing the significance of the year 70 and the significance of the destruction of Jerusalem and of the temple, which then becomes the impetus for the worldwide mission. Now, certainly the Apostle Paul was already engaged in, going out to the nations, but the activity of the church was still, through the time of Acts 15, very much centered in Jerusalem, right? When a major decision had to be made, it was, okay, let's all gather in Jerusalem. And Jerusalem was the epicenter for the mission of the church. And it's not until the temple is destroyed that is really taken away, and the worldwide mission, the global evangelism movement, to use kind of buzzwords. But it's not until that happens, which is what I would say is described in chapters 18 and 19. It's not until Jerusalem falls and Rome begins to fall as the Christian church grows through the world that the millennium begins at that point.
Okay. No, I see where you're coming from. I'm just trying to hash it all out here. So
yeah,
I
the other
guess
option, the other way to take it, right, Zelwyn, and maybe I think this is maybe more familiar to our listeners, is that the millennium began at the resurrection of Jesus, or maybe on the day of Pentecost.
Well, yeah, and absolutely, that's a common way of looking at it. I guess the question that I have, and I'm kind of wrestling with right now, is that if we understand everything before this point in terms of 70, right? If you're thinking strictly in terms of Jerusalem, so that chapter 20 is the beginning of, let's say, the time we're now living in, which I think is kind of the way you're presenting it. Okay.
Correct.
What relevance then does chapters 1 through 19 have for the Christian today? Because it would seem to be over and done. You see what I mean?
Well, it has the relevance of, these things. The fall of Jerusalem serves as a type for how God's judgment comes in the world, right? And the activity of the apostles in the book of Acts, it's kind of like asking what's the significance of that for the church, right? Their activity in the book of Acts and the things that John sees in the book of Revelation, they serve as examples to us. They serve as types to us of what we would expect to happen as nations are evangelized, as nations are then subsequently harden themselves, like Jerusalem did, against the gospel. It wouldn't surprise us to see the kinds of things that John saw in the beginning of Revelation, in symbols, of course, but it wouldn't surprise us to see those sorts of things happening throughout history, which is why, you can find things in the first 20 chapters of Revelation, and you can say, this sounds an awful lot like what happened at the time of the medieval papacy. This sounds an awful lot like these other events in the history of the church, without it necessarily meaning, Martin Luther was the angel of chapter 14 who proclaimed the gospel to the whole world.
So what exactly is the struggle that we have then with understanding chapter 20 in a future sense, right? Because there are many Christian groups who do interpret the millennium as something which is not yet in existence, right? That is something which is still to come. Whether you want to take that in a historic premillennial sense, which is saying that the millennium will begin, and then at the end of that will be the judgment. You can take that in a dispensationalist sense, which of course says that the 7-year period of tribulation, however they want to define it, precedes the 1,000 years in which Christ will then reign on an earthly kingdom. Or you could take that even in a postmillennial sense, right? That the 1,000-year period will begin at some point at which then we will see a growth in the church unlike anything that came before it, right? So those are kind of the other main options out there in the world, and there are serious proponents of each of them. How do we deal with that then? Is this something that why do we struggle with seeing the millennium as something future rather than saying it is something which is happening right now?
I think part of it is related to what we've already talked about, which is the activity of the devil completely suppressed in the millennium, or is it, specifically related to one element of his activity? Because if you take the view that the binding of the devil means he is completely inactive in the world, then you look around at what's happened in the last 2,000 years and you say, well, therefore the millennium hasn't started yet, right? Because we still see satanic activity in the world. And until that is completely suppressed, no millennium, right? So that's why we went at length to say the binding of the devil does not mean total inactivity. It means specific suppression of his deception of the whole world. And of course, there were faithful, Israelites before that, but by and large, the nations that are surrounding them are held under the dominion of the devil until Pentecost comes, right? I mean, Pentecost really is a significant event in the life of the church. The mission of the church doesn't get underway until the Spirit is sent from above, and then it opens up and it goes, right?
Sure. And I think something else that we argue against when it comes to this more purely future understanding of the millennium is that if we assume that, with the exception of maybe like the post-millennial position, if we assume that, we have to assume that Christ is not now reigning, right? That he's not seated in authority, power, and majesty, but rather that he's waiting until the time when that kingdom will begin. And I think that I think is something that we really emphasize, and for good reason, because Jesus says, Matthew chapter 28, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. He's seated at the right hand of the Father, seated in power and majesty. He is reigning, and all things will be put under his feet. The kingship of Christ has already begun. And we don't want to think that it hasn't, because otherwise we might think that, oh, well, all of this is somehow out of his control or something like that. There is that sense, like you say, I mean, Satan still can do things, but there is a sense in which he is being progressively crushed, right?
Yeah, right. And I think this is where, whatever extremes the dispensationalists go to, and they do, we are not a dispensationalist promoting podcast by any means. They do at least have this sense that there has been progress, that over the course of Revelation history, the history of the world, that God has been at work making his promises, keeping his promises, and the devil's activity in the world has been undermined, and the kingdom of Christ has been growing. Now, we're not going to go to an extreme here and say it's the stocks are just always going to keep going up. The kingdom faces all kinds of obstacles as it grows, but I think it is right to see in the history of, certainly in the history of the church, that as the gospel goes out to the nations, the devil is bound, and the gospel brings with it not just spiritual good, but it brings with it progress.
I do want to make one thing clear here. I think you meant post-millennial when you were saying that progression sort of a thing. And there is that, in that sense, we can agree with them, because I would see dispensationalism as a eschatology of pure pessimism, in my opinion. I mean, because they think that everything's basically going to fail right before the end.
Sure. What I meant by them is they at least have this sense of there are these chunks of time in history, and there are major moments in history where things are changing.
Okay.
That's what I mean. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. In that sense, yeah, I would agree with you there. It's just I don't think of them as very positive.
Yeah. Fair enough.
Kind of people.
Fair enough.
I just want to make that clear. So, with that, then we'll go into our next break. We'll be right back with more Word Fitly Spoken. You're listening to A Word Fitly Spoken. I am Zelwyn Heide here with David Appold, continuing our discussion of the book of Revelation. So, David, we've been talking quite a bit about the 1,000 years and all that means and the binding of Satan like that, but I think the one thing that we haven't clarified, at least I don't think we've clarified it as much as we could, is how we are to actually understand the number itself. Mm-hmm. How should we understand 1,000? Is it literal? Is it figurative? If it's figurative, what does it mean? How are we supposed to understand the 1,000-year period?
Yeah, I think we should understand it as a long time. That
right.
That's what 1,000 years is. Whether it's literal or symbolic, it's a long time. So that much is obvious. It is a long time, and the 1,000 years. The taking it as literal would, when we haven't really taken anything else in the book that way, I think would suddenly our hermeneutics are off if we do that, right? So if everything else has been symbolic, the dragon, the woman, the child, certainly the symbols correspond to the realities in John's Revelation. It's not like, he doesn't describe the devil as, a gentle creature. He's a dragon. And he doesn't describe Jesus as a lamb for no reason, or as the Lion of Judah for no reason, right? The symbols correspond to the realities properly. And so here, in the same way, the 1,000 years, why does he use 1,000 if he's not meaning to be literally 1,000 years or literalistically 1,000 years? Well, it's because he wants to signify a long time. And so a long time needs a big number, kind of basically. And then you can get into, you can go into the whole 1,000 is a cube of 10, and 10 is a complete number. So 1,000 is a number of cubed completion, Trinitarian completion. I think all those things have validity to them. But the point for us is it's a figure of a long time. And the long time the way that I read it is from the time of the fall of Jerusalem to the end of the world.
Yeah, and that kind of gets back into our previous discussion. Although I will say the year 1000 AD was a wild time.
Yeah, and that's again, why do people see why is it why has the book of Revelation been misconstrued so many times? Right? Well, it's because there have been things that have happened throughout the history of the church that you could say, man, that sounds just like what it says here in Revelation. And so then you kind of get sucked into this timeline sort of thing of where are we in the book of Revelation, and is it supposed to be, this map or this timeline for the whole history of the church? And that's why that appeals to people, why, looking at the year 1000 and say, oh, that must have been when the millennium ended. But then you get into you have other troubles like saying, well, now it's the year 2023. What happened? Did we miss the end?
What do you have against the reformers, David?
Nothing. I like them.
Well, I only say that because that historic position, a historic view of the book of Revelation,
right,
was really big at the time of the Reformation. In fact,
I know.
Some of the things that we still kind of half hold on to as Lutherans are products of that. Like this idea that Luther is the angel of Revelation 14, for example, stuff like that.
Yeah.
So,
and I mentioned that last. I don't know. Some people will probably, I don't know if they turn off the podcast when I say that I don't think that that's the case. It's not that I don't think that angel's activity can apply to Luther and he can function in a way similar to the angel. I just think if you say that what John saw was Martin Luther, or, was a symbol of Martin Luther, then, you've got 1500 years where what John is writing in the book of Revelation is not happening. And I think that, for us looking back, or for the people at the time of the Reformation, that, oh yeah, this is happening right now. But what about the Christians in the previous 1500 years? Were they just, waiting around in chapter 10? Were they stuck at chapter 10? And now we're up to chapter, 17 or what, I think that you get into you back yourself into a corner that you really can't make sense of the whole book, even if you can say this works really well in a funeral sermon.
Right. Of course, this is where I get kind of snarky and say, well, if it's all 70, then what's the meaning for, the subsequent 15 centuries?
Well, that's like saying, what's the point of the Old Testament? Why? You've got to have types, and you have to understand how how history works in repetitions, but not exact repetitions.
I like how you're taking me seriously, but
yeah, well, I have to, because you speak on behalf of many.
So, if we're going to understand Revelation, the 1,000 years, as a figurative number for a indeterminate but long period of time, during which Satan is bound so that he's no longer able to deceive in the way that he had before, how then should we understand the end of verse 3 when it talks about the end of this 1,000-year period and the release of Satan?
Yeah, so whenever we get to the end of the millennium that we're currently in, and of course it could happen at any time. I think that that's a good thing to always remember here. There's nothing that prevents our Lord from returning, except, like it says in 2 Peter, his own mercy, right? It's the kindness of the Lord that leads us to repentance. He is not slow in keeping his promises, as some count slowness, all those things. At the same time, are we close to the end or not? I think when we started the podcast, we thought we were close to the end. Or when we started the series, we thought we were fairly close to the end, but now maybe we're starting to feel like, well, we've still got some time. And, God did say that he would show his steadfast love to 1,000 generations of those who love him. So, if you give 30 years for a generation, does that seem fair, Zelwyn?
Sure.
From the time of the Exodus, let's say roughly 1500 BC till now, we're at how many, maybe 100 generations. So we still got We could still have a long time, is my point. We could have a very long time still. Or, it could happen tomorrow. But in any case, at the end of the millennium, it says that the devil will be loosed. And this always causes a little bit of concern for people, because obviously that would be a bad thing, right? If the devil's
Right.
loosed. But he's loosed in order for something else to happen. He's not just loosed so that he can, have free course in the world. He's brought out of the abyss, if you want to put it this way, right? It's a divine passive. If you want to get into the grammar, God releases him in order to finally destroy him. So the binding is not permanent for the devil. The permanent thing is being thrown into the lake of fire, which is about to happen. And in order for that to happen, he has to be brought out.
Is this kind of like the restrainer in Second Thessalonians and the man of lawlessness? I mean, I know that's a different figure, and I mean we've talked about him before, but this idea that there's a restraint in place that will persist until it's released, after which the man of lawlessness will appear, right?
Yeah, I think that's a good parallel here, to see that God does restrain Satan and then he brings him out. But he doesn't bring him out to say, okay, we're going to go back to how things used to be, which is he's going to go around deceiving the whole world forever again. But he's brought out, he goes and he gets his army. This is what we're going to see down in verse 7 and 8. He goes and he gets Gog and Magog, and he comes back for a fight, and he's quickly dispatched. So it's the final battle. And in order for that final battle to happen, God has to loose him, or he chooses to. I mean, it's possible that God can do, he's free here, right? He could have just said, well, now that I've got him down in the abyss, I'm going to finish him off. But he brings him out in order for that final battle to be public, I suppose.
Yeah, and we probably won't get into that final battle until the next time we come back to Revelation. But I mean, you do have this release in the sense that he is now able to deceive in the way that he had before. So whatever is going to happen at his release, we're going to see a turning towards him and away from God in a way that we had not seen before. There is a kind of a ramping up of it, even so that it seems like, antiquity is returning in some sense, that will mark the just before the end of days. And I think this is why drawing the parallel between this and the man of lawlessness is also helpful, because of course I see the man of lawlessness in Second Thessalonians as the man of lawlessness, the king who will do as he wills, to use the language of Daniel, the final figure in a long line of figures that who will deceive the nations in a way that had not been done before. So I do think there is a sense in which we can say the end of the 1,000-year period will be a amplification, it'll be a ramping up, but it's a very, very brief period of time.
Correct. I think that's right. I would not expect, based on what's written here, what John sees, the millennium is a long time. The 1,000 years is a long time. And when the time between the end of the millennium and, say, the final throwing of the devil into the lake of fire, there's no time given on that. It doesn't even use the other symbols that John has used at this point, which were, brief time periods, like we mentioned before, 42 months, 1,260 days. How long will that, that post-millennial pre-Lake of Fire time frame last? It seems like it's quick in comparison to the millennium anyways.
Right. Well, and I think too with this, with the release of Satan and the gathering of the nations, which again we'll talk about more when we come back the next time for Revelation, even if we are seeing a ramping up of his deception in a way that, we are not currently experiencing, or maybe we are, I mean, who's to say? But even if that's a ramping up of it, we don't want to think of that as a defeat. Because I think that's often the way that people will hear this. They'll say, oh, things are going to get really, really bad right before the end. I guess that means that somehow the church is going to be defeated. Not at all. Because as you pointed out here, the release of Satan is not him making a jailbreak and getting out and doing what he did before. The release of Satan is something that God allows to happen. He causes it to happen so that Satan will be utterly defeated in the end.
Yeah, I mean, I came across this. This wasn't my own insight, but I think I was reading whose commentary? Peter Lightheart's commentary on Revelation. He says that what happens with the devil in Revelation is kind of like a sick parody of the resurrection. So Jesus is seized, bound, imprisoned in the grave, so to speak, and he breaks out. He rises, ascends on high, and his kingdom advances. Right now, think of what happens with the devil. Since we've seen him in chapter 12, he raised up his beasts, but ever since then, the trajectory is downward, and he's seized, bound, suppressed. Then he's released in sort of a parody of the resurrection. But instead of ascending to authority and power, he goes and gets an army, and instead of them, going through the whole world, he is going to be defeated here. So it's a sick parody of the Lamb and his kingdom with the dragon and his kingdom.
I like it. I think that'll preach. Well, if only because if we see the release of Satan as a kind of anti-resurrection, right? He's coming up out of the pit or whatever. Just, I suppose, as you could say, as Jesus came up out of the pit.
Yeah,
but
yeah.
But the point being that even if that happens, Satan is not thereby being raised to all authority and power. He has a mock authority, which is then quickly crushed.
Yes.
And I think, again, we want to focus on what is happening there and think that that's a reason for fear, but it really isn't. Because no matter how powerful Satan seems to be, no matter how much the world will wonder at him, the fact is he's already defeated. I mean, he's going out defeated. He lost it even before he left the pit.
Right. The eschatology of the New Testament, we've said this many times, is eschatology of hope or eschatology of victory. That doesn't mean that it's completely that there are no obstacles to be faced, no battles to be fought, no persecutions to endure. It just means that as those things are faced and as those things are endured, we don't endure them, black-pilled and despairing and thinking it's all for naught. We endure them knowing that the martyrs will be vindicated, that they have been vindicated, and that those who suffer persecution will not be forgotten, will not be lost. It's not a lost cause. You're not fighting some useless battle that doesn't have anything to do with the ultimate victory of the war, right? Every battle that the Christian fights is part of the Lamb's war on Satan, and the victory will be shared by all those whose names are written in the book of life, as it's going to say later in the chapter.
I mean, is not the cross a victory? Is not Jesus triumphing over the devil, a victory? I mean, and how does that happen? It happens through his death, through his suffering. And we, as those who are washed in the blood of the Lamb, will follow in his footsteps. A servant is not above his master. If they hated me, they're going to hate you. But if Christ is victorious through such suffering, if he is glorified through such suffering, so will we. So yes, Satan is going to do his parody resurrection or whatever at the end, but that's all he has. He has nothing to look forward to. We who suffer can look forward to glory.
And I think that sets us up nicely, Zelwyn, for where we want to go with this, which is to see, okay, we've just been doing these first three verses for good reason, because there's lots of questions about the millennium and when does that start? When does it end? How long does it last? But what John spends a little more time on is what comes next, which is the describing what else happens during the millennium. So you have this note about at the end of the millennium, the devil will be released. That doesn't get picked up then again until verse 7. But in verses 4 through 6, you hear a description of what else is happening during the millennium. Okay, the devil is, his deceptions are suppressed, and now in some way the martyrs rule. And I think we want to spend some time just thinking through, how does martyrdom, and this came up in what you were saying, because it's through the cross of Jesus that the victory is won. So how is it that martyrdom actually advances the gospel? How can martyrdom be a victory when it looks like you've lost everything, right? Your life is taken from you. And we can spend a good portion of our next episode thinking through and talking through the specifics of how martyrdom, we can look at it historically. How did martyrdom actually conquer Rome, the Roman Empire? But we can also then talk more presently too, in what way does the little martyrdom that we are all called to, how does that actually prove to be victorious?
Very good. Well, David, any final thoughts before we close out for today?
I think we've only spent our time here on those first 3 verses, but we'll come back. I don't know when we'll do the next episode. It depends. You and Willie can tell me when you're ready to go on with martyrs and with the end here of chapter 20, because there's a lot more to the book of Revelation. There's a lot more to eschatology. As important as getting the millennium right is, it's one part of the whole. And so having some clarity about it, hopefully this episode has brought a little bit of clarity, but you also see that there's more to the book. There's more to eschatology than just saying, do you believe in a literal 1,000 years or a figurative 1,000 years?
Or do you want to just talk about it for an hour?
Yeah.
Well, very good. Well, this has been A Word Fitly Spoken. If you like what you hear, check us out, wordfitlyspoken.org, facebook.com/wordfitly, or Twitter @wordfitly. I'm Zelwyn Heide here with David Appold. God love you, and God bless.
And yet the verse of the gospel will not be untrue. Who entereth into the house of the strong one to spoil his goods, unless he shall first have bound the strong one? For in accordance with this true saying, that order is observed, the strong one first bound, and then his goods spoiled. For the church is so increased by the weak and strong from all nations far and near, that by its most robust faith in things divinely predicted and accomplished, it shall be able to spoil the goods of even the unbound devil. St. Augustine, City of God.